Hello, everybody. Good evening. My name is Morgan. I am an AmeriCorps member with Conservation Nebraska. Thanks for joining us tonight. We've got a wonderful hour and a half with Brett Andersen. Going to go over some at-risk species conservation in Nebraska for us tonight. Thank you, Brett, for doing this with us. A couple things to go over. Your microphones, your cameras will be turned off during the presentation. If you guys do have any questions, please go ahead and put those in the chat or the Q&A section. And I certainly hope we've got some time to go over those with you guys once Brett's done. And then towards the end of our webinar tonight, we will launch a poll for everybody to take. If you've got just a minute to fill those questions out, we would appreciate it. It helps us plan some future events and gives us some good feedback. So I will pass it over to Brett and we will get started.
Excellent. Thank you, Morgan. Just to clarify, you can see my slides, but not my presenter view, correct?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. So I want to thank you all for joining this evening. My name is Brett Andersen, and I am the Wildlife Diversity Program Manager at the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. This evening, I'll be talking to you all about at-risk species conservation, the Natural Legacy Project in Nebraska, its ongoing revision process, what the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission is doing for conservation, and then how you can take part in conservation as well. So over the last several years, we have been bombarded with headlines left and right that really highlight the decline of our native wildlife species in the country, whether it's pollinators, birds, or even bats. It's easy to become very pessimistic about the outlook of once common wildlife and plant species across our nation. However, tonight's focus is going to shift away from the negative headlines and focus a lot more attention on the lesser known positives, and that's the successes of conservation and our plan for action in Nebraska. So one thing I really want to highlight is there's this reality that we know that if we devote resources to conservation, it works. Our consumptive users, our hunters and our anglers acknowledged this long ago and supported self-imposed taxes through the Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson Acts, enacted in 1937 and 1950, respectively. These were aimed to conserve the species that they ultimately hunted and fished for. So they were kind of the original conservationists in our country. Did you know that the wild turkey, a species that's pretty common in our state nowadays, was completely extirpated from Nebraska by about 1915, and they were actually reintroduced into Nebraska way back in 1959. So now turkeys are prevalent, and we even have a spring hunting season ongoing right now where people are able to harvest turkeys in the state. But it was a species that not long ago was not even present in our state. In addition to that, a similar occurrence took place with elk. Elk were once common across Nebraska, but were completely wiped out from the state by 1900. They began to slowly make a return in Nebraska in the early 1960s, and we're kind of starting to see them make their way further east. You'll get sightings here and there of them kind of roaming, especially along the I-80 corridor, where we've seen them kind of in the Ashland area here and there on occasion. Those are wild elk that are kind of moving through the area. Historically, they always belonged here, but again, they were kind of pushed out to the west and retreated back in the Rocky Mountains, and they progressively spread east again. As time has passed, the need for conservation extended beyond game species, and in 1973, the Endangered Species Act was enacted to protect species on the brink of extinction. Similar to game species conservation, we observed similar success with the recovery of our nation's symbol, the bald eagle. I know that I'm not the only one that is in awe every time I see one of these, but there was a time not long ago where they were actually a rare sight to behold. In fact, bald eagle recovery has been so successful in Nebraska that nest monitoring was concluded after 2018 due to the, quote, ever increasing number of nests in the state. So we literally abandoned our monitoring efforts because bald eagles were doing so well. And that's a fantastic highlight of conservation success. And since we're in Nebraska, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge a species that our state is well known for, the whooping crane, who is currently embarking on its spring migration through central Nebraska. Just a few weeks ago, we had 91 of these endangered birds stopping over on the Platte River. If you had not observed the crane migration, I would highly recommend traveling to central Nebraska to observe this global phenomenon. With all this said, it was not until the early 2000s that Congress acknowledged that there was a suite of species missing from the conservation list. There was a whole host of species that were in decline but lacked funding necessary to study and recover populations. Imagine the health of a wildlife population compared to our own health. It is far easier to recover if you catch an illness early enough, but if you wait too long, it becomes a lot more difficult and a lot more expensive. Congress decided to put the power into the states to identify what they classified as species of greatest conservation need and develop a plan for recovering those species. They classified these as state wildlife action plans, or SWAPs, and to help states to implement their SWAPs, Congress provided funding through state wildlife grants in 2000 to conserve at-risk species. The first iteration of Nebraska SWAP was published in 2005. We, unlike other states, actually named our state wildlife action plan, and we classified it as the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project. And the idea behind this was to conserve the natural legacy in Nebraska. Although the development of this plan was facilitated by the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, it was intended to be the state of Nebraska as a whole's plan, and as a result, consisted of numerous partners, including universities, nonprofit organizations, private landowners, and members of the public. This plan addressed key elements required by Congress: species of greatest conservation need, or SGCN for short, priority habitats used by those species, threats causing the decline of those species and their habitats, actions to monitor those threats and recover the species, and finally, monitoring plans to evaluate the trends in populations and determine if conservation efforts were indeed successful or not. Another requirement by Congress was that states were required to update their SWAPs no less than once every 10 years. The initial editors were not overly satisfied with the first edition of the plan, so they proactively developed a second edition published in 2011. Later, in 2018, a supplement was added to update the list of at-risk species in the state. However, this didn't actually constitute a formal revision of the entire plan. Now, despite all of these iterations of the plan, the mission statement has remained the same, and that is to implement a blueprint for conserving Nebraska's flora, fauna, and natural habitats through the proactive voluntary conservation actions of partners, communities, and individuals. It is important to acknowledge that this is a guidance document and not a regulatory one. Thus, we want to ensure that the contents of the plan are supported by all Nebraskans and subsequently implemented in our state. In addition to the mission statement, the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project also identified 4 goals that have not changed. First was the impetus behind the development of SWAPs in the first place, and that was to reverse the decline of at-risk species and avoid the need for their listing as federally threatened or endangered. The second was to recover currently listed species and allow for their delisting. Just because a species is classified as federally threatened or endangered does not mean that we stop putting focus into their conservation. Rather, we are intent on devoting more of our resources to recovering those species. The third is an overlooked but very important goal, and that is to keep common species common. If you look at points number 1 and number 2, species falling into those categories are there because they were once a lot more common than they are today. Therefore, we want to ensure that the species that are currently common remain that way. Finally, we have a focus in our state of conserving the natural communities with a philosophy that conserving the habitats that species occur in will conserve the suite of species that occupy those habitats. So now looking a little bit at the specifics within the plan, the 2018 supplement to the Legacy Project identified 735 species as at risk in Nebraska. We divided these into 2 tiers. Tier 1 species were those globally most at risk of extinction. When we consider species that could be classified as federally threatened or endangered, the tier 1 at-risk species could be knocking on that door. Thus, we prioritize our conservation on those species. Tier 2 species are those that are imperiled or vulnerable to extirpation from the state of Nebraska. Nebraska is uniquely positioned geographically between the western edge of eastern deciduous forests to the east and at the foothills of the Rocky Mountains to the west. Thus, we have forest species that occupy habitats in extreme eastern Nebraska, especially along the Missouri River, and mountainous species that occur in rocky terrain in the Nebraska Panhandle. While not as high of a priority as tier 1 species, tier 2 species still need protection so we don't lose them from our state. So I want to note with this as well that you will see in that pie chart that over half of our at-risk species are plants. This is especially notable in Nebraska because we are one of the few states that actually recognize at-risk plant species in our state wildlife action plans. This is a tip of the hat to the botanists in our state that reviewed and evaluated our declining plant species. As mentioned before, Nebraska has taken the conservation philosophy that occupying the habitat conserving the habitat conserves the species that occupy it. And in recognizing 735 at-risk species, it is easy to see that we cannot realistically tackle each species individually. However, if you take it from a habitat approach, for example, if you restore a stream that contains 7 at-risk fish, 3 at-risk insects, 10 at-risk plant species, that one action contributes to the recovery of 20 species as a whole. With that said, if we prioritize the entire state for conservation, then none of it is really a priority. Thus, we looked for unique habitats that would give us the most bang for our buck when conserving at-risk species. We classified 35 areas as biologically unique landscapes, abbreviated as BULs, with the idea that conserving habitat in these areas would conserve the greatest diversity of at-risk species in Nebraska. Within these BULs, we identified 20 demonstration sites, which are public access locations that highlight successful implementation of the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project. Now, returning to the Legacy Project as a whole, we are currently in the process of revising and updating the plan. The supplement, published in 2018, was important for updating our at-risk species, but it did not constitute a major revision. As such, we were due to complete a comprehensive revision of the plan, which was due in 2021. However, we really valued the importance of those face-to-face interactions with the public to discuss the revision of the plan. But because of the COVID pandemic, these in-person meetings were not possible. Thus, we requested and were granted an extension on the 3rd edition of the plan, and that extension extended us until October of 2025. This puts us back on track with most states that were on a 2005, 2015, 2025 timeline for revising their swaps. And this is really nice because the region or the entire nation is currently working on developing a number of resources that the states can use for helping with revising that plan. In addition to revising the plan, we identified several additional goals with this state wildlife action plan revision. First was to truly embrace the terms action and plan and determine what is most feasible to accomplish within the next 10 years. The second is efforts and become more strategic in implementing habitat conservation. Next, we wanted to expand our focus on aquatic systems. Our swap is driven heavily by conservation of terrestrial landscapes, and so we want to broaden our focus of aquatic systems. Finally, we want to improve the relevancy of the plan, acknowledging that conservation expands beyond boots on the ground research and habitat work. We want to enhance our recommendations for wildlife education to get more Nebraska-centric conservation examples in our curriculum and outreach programs, and identify ways to promote conservation in our rapidly growing wildlife recreation industry. Those that enjoy the outdoors have a connection to nature, and we want to ensure that we foster that connection through conservation. Please note that throughout the summer of this year, we'll be providing a number of surveys that the public can respond to. And so if you have thoughts and opinions on how we can go about promoting conservation in our state, we strongly encourage you completing those surveys and help provide us with that feedback. So I'm going to shift focus a little bit here. We talked about the legacy plan as a whole. Now I wanted to shift the focus to some of the conservation projects that we have going on at the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. For our Lincoln residents, you may be familiar with the recent headlines on southern flying squirrels. These mammals are an eastern forest-dwelling squirrel that are known to occur along the Missouri River in Nebraska. Because of their retracted range in the state, they are classified as a state threatened species. Just a few years ago, there was a sighting reported nearly 60 miles from known locations, actually in Lincoln. The question now is, where did they come from and where are they now? We are collecting genetic samples to determine whether the squirrels in Lincoln naturally moved into town or if they were a released pet from an irresponsible college student. And so that information will help us determine whether or not the population that occurs in Lincoln is one that we want to focus our conservation priorities to. And subsequently, how did those squirrels make it into Lincoln? If it is the latter, then they won't take as high of a priority of focus as we would have focused on prior to that. Regardless, the flying squirrel population is doing quite well in Lincoln, and researchers are documenting new occurrences all the time. We have acoustic detectors up that detect the ultrasonic calls produced by these nocturnal squirrels, which is really neat. So the recordings that they produce are actually sounds that we can't hear with our ears because they're ultrasonic, so they're above our hearing level. But we have recording equipment that can actually pick up those sounds from those flying squirrels. Trust me, you wouldn't want to hear these sounds because they would keep you up all night long. So be thankful that we can't hear those. In addition to that, we encourage that anyone from the public that sees flying squirrels submit sightings to the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission so we can continue to document the spread of this species in the Lincoln area. Moving on here, the freshwater mussel propagation project is probably one of my favorite efforts going on right now. Contrary to all the reports and concerns over the highly invasive zebra mussel species, not all mussel species in Nebraska are bad. Many of the species that occur in Nebraska are critically imperiled due to a number of factors, including drought, pollution, and invasive species such as the zebra mussel. In addition to studying the distribution and habitat preferences of freshwater mussels, our North Platte Fish Hatchery, which is a hatchery that's responsible for a lot of the game fish that you catch in our lakes and reservoirs, found that they had quite the skill at producing our freshwater mussels. Since 2018, the hatchery has produced over 78,000 mussels and returned those mussels to historic locations across Nebraska. We actually just received a grant this past winter that will allow us to continue these efforts for another 3 years and allow us to experiment and produce 4 additional mussel species that will be reintroduced to waterways across the state. American burying beetles, or ABBs, are a federally threatened species of insect that occurs in the sandhills of Nebraska. This is a really cool species because they are actually carrion specialists. So they look for dead mice, rats, rodents, etc. And what they'll do is they'll actually lay their eggs on the carcass and bury it underground, hence the name American burying beetle. The larvae then hatch, feed on that carcass, decompose it, and then metamorphose into an adult beetle. Now, one issue that they were facing is that farmers and ranchers in the area were tilling up their land, and because obviously these beetles can't necessarily dig very deep to raise their offspring, they were actually getting tilled up and their populations were in drastic decline. However, we've been working collaboratively with private landowners across the state, implementing best management practices to conserve American burying beetle and have had resounding success with that. So every single year in August, researchers of the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission survey for these beetles where ABB are tagged and released, and other carrion beetles depicted on that picture on the bottom right are counted. Again, keeping those common species common, we want to count common species and determine if those populations are remaining relatively stable. The results of these surveys allow us to calculate population estimates and determine whether management practices are in fact working in our state. What's really neat about this American burying beetle work is that American burying beetle once extended in their range from the foothills of the Rocky Mountains all the way to the eastern seaboard. And now they have a few remnant populations, and the stronghold for this species is actually found in the sandhills of Nebraska. So we've been working collaboratively with the Cincinnati Zoo to capture and reintroduce individuals from our population back into Ohio to help recover that population in that state as well. Another really neat project going on right now is a study of American woodcock, which is a species of eastern forest dwelling bird that has expanded its range into the Great Plains. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, wait, this is a forest species. Well, they've expanded into grassland habitat. Part of that has to do with the expanse of woodland habitat into Nebraska. So it's actually allowed them to expand their range. Researchers at the Game and Parks Commission outfitted 15 woodcock with satellite tags to track their movements during spring and fall migration. What they found was that most birds actually stayed west during their long distance movements, so west of their historic range, which extended into kind of central Iowa and central Minnesota. You can see that the birds moving here on each of those lines in that map were moving from Nebraska north into Canada and then back south, passing through Nebraska in a lot of instances and going down into Texas and Louisiana. Now, of course, like all research studies, there always has to be outliers. So you'll note the one individual in the fall in yellow decided to fly from Nebraska up into Canada in spring, but then go south into Virginia in the fall and winter. So there are always outliers to our survey efforts. Finally, researchers at the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission and University of Nebraska at Lincoln investigated the effects of stream channelization in the sandhills. In a survey of 28 sites, they marked pearl dace, an at-risk species that occurs in streams in the sandhills, with a visual implant elastomer or VIE tag. So kind of think of it almost like a tattoo for a fish. And what they did is they actually determined that survival of these native fish species was greater in unchannelized streams. What this means is that this supports the need to restore stream habitat for native fish species. So a lot of the actions that we implement in the State Wildlife Action Plan are developed through various research projects that help us confirm or identify ways to recover at-risk species. So again, transitioning again here, we focused our attention initially on our at-risk species, on the legacy plan, and then what Game and Parks was doing. So now we focus on you. What can you contribute to conservation with the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission? So the first of these is one I wanted to highlight, and part of the reason why I'm being a little brief with my presentation this evening, and that's because we actually have the City Nature Challenge, which is an event that is coming up April 26th through the 29th. The goal of this project is to find, document, and protect urban wildlife. There will be 3 focal cities in Nebraska: Omaha, Lincoln, and Scottsbluff, but all are welcome to participate across the state. If this is an event that you would be interested in, there is actually an online webinar this evening starting at 6 p.m. with more information. If you search City Nature Challenge Nebraska, you should be able to pull up that website, register for the event, and learn more how you can take part. The second is an event that's actually going to be kicking off tomorrow. The Nebraska Bumblebee Atlas has been a long-term citizen science project that we've been doing in Nebraska since 2019. It's another really neat opportunity to get hands-on experience with wildlife. We are documenting bumblebees across the state of Nebraska with a virtual training scheduled for tomorrow evening at 5:30 p.m. You can access that information at www.bumblebeeatlas.org. Click on Nebraska and look at the events, and you'll be able to register for that event. This training will be recorded, so if you're unable to attend that event, you can view it at any time. Surveys for this event run from June 1st to September 30th. And the process for monitoring is actually really simple. What you do is you find a flower patch, you start a timer, and your goal is to catch and photograph as many bumblebees as you can in 45 minutes. Now you might be thinking to yourself, how can I photograph a bumblebee? Well, what's really neat with bees is that they're ectotherms, so they rely on outside temperature to warm up and be active. So what you can do is you can actually take a bee, put it in a jar, and put it on ice. What that does is that cools the bumblebee down to the point where they're inactive. You then take them out, photograph them as necessary, and then as they warm up, they fly off like nothing ever happened at all. So this is a really valuable exercise to allow us to identify our various bumblebee species. The reason we do this is because if you just took a picture of a bumblebee on a flower, a lot of times it doesn't get the information and the details we need to identify that species to its species. So by getting those specific close-up images, and you can do these just on your phone, we're able to identify those individuals that you capture to species, and it helps us document bumblebees in Nebraska. Again, most likely documenting common species, but also potentially documenting rare species as well. For example, last fall, we actually documented the western bumblebee in Nebraska for the first time since 2017 on one of these surveys. So it's really valuable and really important for us to be documenting not only the common species, but the rare species as well. The second survey that I want to highlight here is the Nebraska Big Butterfly Count. This is actually a new survey that's kicking off in 2024. On Saturday, May 4th, there is a free in-person training from 1 to 5 p.m. in Marquette, Nebraska, for interested people to learn about the survey process and identify butterflies in central and eastern Nebraska. This was actually developed by a retired school teacher based in Omaha. She's been working on monitoring butterfly populations at Homestead, Fontenelle Forest, Lawrence Gardens, and Ponca State Park for the last several years. And because of the success and because of the ability that she has had to take pictures and identify butterflies to species, we want to expand those efforts across the entire state. Now, the panhandle of Nebraska gets a little bit complicated because we start seeing a lot of species that occur nowhere else in Nebraska. So for this effort, we're going to concentrate our focus to eastern and central Nebraska. Again, that in-person training is free to attend. May 4th is that event. There is a registration page for that. You can just search the Nebraska Big Butterfly Count, and you should be able to locate that event as well. The next one here is an ongoing survey going on across Nebraska, another long-standing survey to document the populations of monarch and regal butterfly, or regal fritillated butterflies. These trainings are taking place in person. One is at Homestead State Historical Park. This is on May 18th. And the other one is at Schramm State Recreation Area on June 1st. At these events, you'll learn how to go about doing a monitoring and a survey project, and then be able to test your skills with distance estimates and being able to identify the target butterfly species. So if these projects are of interest to you, or if you're interested in additional projects, what you can do is you can view all of our community science opportunities in Nebraska by visiting our community science page at outdoornebraska.gov, or you can scan the QR code that's found on this slide. And what you'll see here is there are some state-specific efforts. We have a camera trap survey going on, trying to go through camera trap footage across the state and look for spotted skunks. We also have a bat monitoring project where you can help with deployment of acoustic detectors to record bat activity. And there's a lot of examples at the state level. There are also a lot of national scale community science projects, things such as Feeder Watch, where you document the birds that are coming into your bird feeder in your backyard, among a number of other community science projects. So strongly encourage you to check out our website, see what opportunities you can be part of, and be a community scientist to help contribute data and help us to conserve at-risk species. Now, if you don't want a formal survey, but you do want to have a little bit more fun with going out and documenting our wildlife in Nebraska, starting in May, we have our second annual Nebraska Birding Bowl. What this is a 3-month-long statewide birding competition, and it's for all skill levels. So what we encourage you to do is either go solo or as part of a group, get together, register, and complete various objectives and activities identifying birds in your local area. Those that complete the objectives will be entered for a chance to win numerous prizes such as binoculars, field guides, and the top prize this year, which is actually $1,000 cash. Strongly recommend you take a look at that. There will be some training events coming up if you're interested in learning more how to participate. If you participated last year, fantastic. We strongly recommend you taking part in it again. Also consider events hosted by the Nebraska Wildlife Education Division. One of these is to test your knowledge at one of our Nature Nerd Trivia Nights. The next event for this is actually May 15th. It's hosted at multiple locations concurrently across Nebraska. The reason we host those concurrently is it's hard to come up with nature trivia questions sometimes. And so what we do is we come up with a series of questions and then run all of these trivia nights simultaneously in different parts of the state and ask those same questions at all those locations. If you don't feel terribly comfortable with your knowledge, you are always more than welcome to learn more. Our education division develops a Science of series that's actually available, all the recordings on their YouTube page, and they have different focal areas that you can actually learn more about the wildlife and plants within our state. If you want a little bit more of a hands-on experience, you can take a look at our Nature at Nightfall events, which focus on nocturnal species in the state. These events won't occur until the fall, but we have one scheduled for Platte River State Park in August, and we have one at Prairie Pines Nature Preserve at the end of September. At these events, we have a number of hands-on activities, such as looking at snakes and other reptiles, going out and participating in moth lighting, or assisting myself who goes out and actually nets for bats at night. So it's a really cool opportunity experience to see some really unique wildlife in the state. In addition to that, we also have bio blitzes that are taking place in the Southwest District of Nebraska. One is May 25th at Red Willow, and the other one is June 1st at Ash Hollow. At these, we have professionals from across Nebraska come out and take part in a number of surveys, kind of a crash course of survey effort within one location in Nebraska. And at these surveys, what we'll do is we'll do a number of different projects, such as bird watching, small mammal trapping, a lot of different options. Again, in the evening, we focus our attention back to nocturnal species such as moths and bats again, but it really allows us to interact with the public, share information on our unique species, and give you that unique opportunity to see unique species in Nebraska close up. If you're interested in getting more information, I strongly recommend that you follow the Nebraska Wildlife Education Facebook page to get more details. They post new events all the time, and they also come up with a lot of creative content and a lot of educational material that you can learn more about the wildlife in our state. Finally, if you would like to donate to conservation, you can support the Wildlife Conservation Fund. This funded a lot of the projects that I presented today, and it'll continue funding a lot of the conservation work that's going on in Nebraska. By donating $30 or more, you can receive a Do Something Wild t-shirt, which depicts the greater prairie chicken, one of our state's most charismatic but at-risk species. This is actually a new shirt that we unveiled for 2024. The old Do Something Wild shirt was something that we had going on for quite a while, and we decided to update that for you all this year. Additionally, we have 3 unique designs of native Nebraska species depicted on license plates. If you decide to select one of those license plates, the funds and proceeds of those license plate sales go to the Nebraska Wildlife Conservation Fund, and they go to a number of the projects that we conduct. Again, a lot of the ones I highlighted today. So with that, again, I tried to breeze through this fairly quickly. If anyone is interested in attending that City Nature Challenge webinar tonight, I strongly recommend you hop over onto that QR code, go to the City Nature Challenge page, and pull up that information. Otherwise, I'm happy to stick around tonight, answer any questions that anyone has, talk a little bit more about conservation in the state. I only highlighted a handful of the at-risk projects going on in Nebraska. Happy to talk about more, but I want to thank you all for taking part tonight. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at my email, brett.andersen@nebraska.gov, and I'm happy to respond to any questions that anyone has tonight or at a later time.
Perfect. It does look like somebody would like you to please share your PowerPoint with them, which your email is pulled up. So hopefully they can write that down and reach out to you. I know that we do also record these sessions, so they will be available at a later date to rewatch, look over again if anybody is interested in that or happen to miss anything tonight too.
Perfect. Yeah, Renee, if you just want to send me an email, I can forward that presentation to you.
Thank you. And then as everyone will see, Amanda has launched our poll. If you also don't mind taking a minute to just go through some of those and fill that out for us, we do appreciate that as well. And then I'm not seeing any questions now, but Brett, maybe you'll get some follow-up emails, and then hopefully everybody enjoyed. I actually hadn't heard of some of those events and things coming up, but I do really think the Nebraska Bumblebee Atlas is interesting. I wasn't aware of that, so I think you brought up some great things to attend, great things for us to reach out to the community. Peggy says, very interesting presentation, thank you. And we have someone that just says, hi, Brett, from Glenn, which I believe you can see. I don't want to say last names, but you should be able to see the attendee list. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all. And yeah, hi, Glenn. It feels like we keep crossing paths a lot over the last couple of days.
Perfect. If there isn't any other questions tonight, we will go ahead and wrap it up, but please feel free to reach out to Brett or any of us here over at Conservation Nebraska with any more questions, and we can always follow up, send them over to him. So thank you, everyone.